He thought he was kicking down a nobody. But she was the most powerful woman in the city. On a quiet street, a black woman stepped out of a luxury car, carrying herself with grace and dignity. But within seconds, flashing lights painted the night red and blue. A cop stormed over, anger in his eyes, blind to who she really was. His boot struck first, and her pride shattered. He had no idea whose eyes were silently watching from the shadows. The officer's rage boiled without reason. He saw only skin, not success. He shoved her down, her designer heels scraping the pavement, her tears mixing with the city dust. Around them, silence thickened, strangers froze, but no one stepped forward. In that moment, she wasn't a billionaire. She was just another black woman swallowed by prejudice. The night air carried a stillness that almost felt like judgment itself, the kind that doesn't come from people but from the weight of history pressing down on a single moment. Her hands trembled as she touched the ground, the pain burning across her palms where the rough concrete had bitten into her skin. The world around her had blurred into muffled sounds, car horns in the distance, murmurs of the bystanders, the sharp crackle of the police radio on the officer's shoulder. Yet through that haze, one thing was clear. The feeling of being invisible, erased of her worth, reduced to nothing more than the color of her skin. She had walked this path many times before, though not always in heels that cost more than most people's monthly salaries. But it didn't matter. In the officer's eyes, none of it mattered. He didn't see the global empire she had built, the countless lives she had touched with her wealth and vision. He didn't see the boardrooms where her voice carried more weight than the men who once tried to silence her. He didn't see the resilience of a woman who rose from poverty to stand on the peaks of unimaginable success. No, all he saw was his own reflection of power, distorted by hate, sharpened by authority, and justified by prejudice. And so he struck, without thought, without care, without even the faintest awareness of the history he had just written in a single act of violence. The crowd that gathered was not a sea of action but a mirror of hesitation. Eyes darted, hands shook with phones clutched tightly, some already recording, others frozen in fear of what would happen if they intervened. The city lights flickered above, reflecting in the tears streaming down her face, mixing with dust and shame, but not defeat. She tried to push herself up, but the officer's hand came down heavy, pressing her back against the ground as if to remind her of the place he believed she belonged. "Stay down," he barked, his voice dripping with authority, not realizing that the very ground he forced her upon would soon become the stage for his ruin. Her breath caught in her chest as she felt the weight of his boot near her shoulder, the same boot that had shoved her into the dirt. Memories flashed not of wealth or luxury but of the little girl she once was, walking through neighborhoods where fear clung to every doorway. She remembered her mother's trembling hands pulling her close, whispering promises that one day she would rise above it all. She remembered nights spent studying under flickering bulbs, days filled with ridicule, the sting of being underestimated, the endless climb toward dignity and respect. And now, after building a world where she thought she was finally untouchable, she was thrown back to where it had all begun, face pressed against the pavement, fighting not just for herself but for every silent voice watching. The officer's rage wasn't his alone, it was borrowed rage. Centuries old, fed by a system that rewarded cruelty when cloaked in uniform. His breathing was heavy, his grip tight, but beneath his control there was ignorance. He had no idea who she was. He had no idea of the name that made powerful men stand taller when she entered a room. He had no idea that her signature could move billions, that her smile could sway markets, that her investments had built hospitals in this very city, hospitals that had once saved the lives of officers just like him. To him, she was just another black woman, and he treated her with a kind of contempt that history had rehearsed too many times before. The people around began to stir. Whispers grew louder. "Isn't that?" One voice trailed off, uncertain but curious. Another phone lifted higher, capturing not just the brutality but the injustice, the raw imbalance of power. Yet still, no one stepped forward. The fear of authority chained them all, the kind of fear that made good people turn away when evil unfolded in front of their eyes. And as she lay there, breaths shallow, a thought coursed through her mind like fire. How many times had this very scene played out before, unseen, unrecorded, unchallenged? How many nameless women had been swallowed by the silence of witnesses who looked away? But tonight was different. Tonight, someone was watching, not from the crowd, not from behind a phone screen, but from the sleek black limousine parked just beyond the shadows. The tinted glass reflected the chaos, but behind it sat eyes that burned with fury. The mayor of the city, a man who owed his very campaign success to the woman, now pressed into the ground, watched every second. His fists clenched as his chest heaved with disbelief. He had promised her once that the city would honor her name, and now here she was, dishonored by the very badge sworn to protect. The officer barked again, demanding identification, demanding respect he did not give. She said nothing. Her silence was louder than any protest, heavier than any plea. It was the silence of someone who had fought her whole life to be seen, only to be made invisible once more. The officer mistook it for defiance, his anger swelling further. He pulled her up roughly, shoving her against the car, the gleam of her diamond bracelet catching the streetlight for a fleeting second. For the first time, someone in the crowd gasped audibly, recognizing the bracelet that had once been featured in magazines, a symbol of power and wealth. Slowly, realization began to ripple through the silence. Her lips parted, but no words came. She didn't beg. She didn't cry out. Instead, she looked straight at the officer, her eyes locking onto his with a calmness that unsettled him. For in that gaze was something he did not expect, not fear, not submission, but the kind of quiet strength that comes from a lifetime of surviving battles far greater than his cruelty. And as their eyes held, he faltered, if only for a second. But the second was enough. The limousine door opened. The mayor stepped out, his presence commanding immediate attention. The crowd stirred, voices rising, phones pointing. The officer's hand loosened as he turned his head, confused by the sudden shift. The mayor's voice sliced through the night air, sharp and furious. "Do you know who this woman is?" The question echoed like thunder, shaking the fragile balance of the moment. The officer stammered, his confidence crumbling. He looked at the woman again, really looked, and in that instant, recognition began to seep into his face like poison. The billionaire rose to her feet, dust clinging to her dress. Her heels scuffed, her dignity bruised but not broken. She stood taller than she had before, the weight of humiliation transformed into an aura of unshakable power. The crowd, emboldened by the mayor's arrival, moved closer, their voices louder now, no longer whispers but declarations. The cameras caught everything: the officer's trembling hands, the shame painted across his features, the strength radiating from the woman he had tried to break. Her voice, steady and unshaken, finally broke the silence. "You didn't see me," she said, her words heavy, deliberate. "But now the world will." And she was right, because in that moment, with the cameras rolling, with the city's leader standing by her side, with the crowd awakened from their silence, the story was no longer about an officer's rage. It was about the resilience of a woman who had fought her entire life to rise, only to be shoved down, and who stood again not just for herself, but for everyone watching. The night would carry her story across headlines, screens, and conversations. The officer's career would shatter beneath the weight of the truth, while her name would rise higher, not for her wealth, but for her unbreakable spirit. And though the scars of that night would remain, so too would the legacy of her strength. For she was never just another black woman. She was a symbol, a force, a voice. And when the world finally saw her, they saw not her pain but her power. And in the silence that followed, the city itself seemed to breathe again, as if acknowledging that something had shifted, something that could never again be unseen. As she struggled to rise, a black limousine pulled up quietly. The window rolled down. It wasn't just a witness, it was the mayor, a lifelong ally who knew her true story. He watched in disbelief, his anger simmering. The cop had just struck the very woman whose investments had built hospitals, schools, and shelters in that very city. The silence in the air seemed to shift, as if the city itself had paused to watch what would unfold next. Her knees trembled as she tried to push herself upright, the rough scrape of concrete burning against her palms. The officer's hand was still firm on her arm, not gentle, not supportive, but pressing down with the force of disdain. His breathing was heavy, short bursts of authority-driven anger, and though his badge gleamed under the harsh glow of the streetlight, it was now tainted by the act he had just committed. He had no idea who he had laid hands on. To him, she was just another figure in the night, someone to intimidate, someone to control. The limousine sat like a shadowed sentinel, its black sheen reflecting fragments of streetlight, the glass rolling down slowly as though time itself was dragging the moment into eternity. Behind that tinted glass, the mayor's eyes burned with disbelief. This wasn't just a wealthy woman. This wasn't just a name on a Forbes list. She was the heartbeat of half the city's progress, the hand that had lifted communities, the mind that had poured wealth into schools when politicians turned their backs, the one who had quietly built shelters for the homeless, hospitals for the sick, and centers for children who had nowhere else to go. She wasn't just a philanthropist, she was a lifeline, and the mayor knew it better than anyone. His heart raced as he watched the officer shove her once more, his voice raised now, demanding identification, demanding answers he didn't deserve. The mayor's fists clenched inside the limousine. Every second felt like a betrayal, not just to her but to the city itself. How could this be happening here, on the very streets that bore the marks of her generosity? How could a woman who had lifted thousands be brought so low by one man, blinded by his own prejudice? The woman's eyes lifted toward the limousine for the briefest second, her vision blurry with tears, her pride fractured but not destroyed. She saw the shadowed outline of the mayor, and though he had yet to move, the flicker of recognition in her gaze was enough to tell her she wasn't alone. Still, she held her silence, not begging, not pleading, but standing in her pain with the dignity that had carried her through a lifetime of battles. The crowd had grown larger now. Phones pointed, whispers traveled, and yet no one stepped in to stop the brutality. Fear held them in place, the kind of fear that history had embedded deep into society, the fear of authority, the fear of consequence, the fear of being the next target. but in their silence, their eyes bore witness, and their recordings captured every cruel second. The officer shoved her once more, pinning her against her car, the glass rattling as her shoulder struck the door. The mayor's patience cracked. He had spent years beside her, watching her rise, watching her transform neighborhoods that others ignored. He remembered late nights when they sat together discussing the future of the city, when she promised him she would give more than money, she would give her heart. And she had. Every promise kept, every project completed. And now, to see her reduced to this on her knees before a man who had no idea of her worth ignited a fury in him that no political restraint could contain. Slowly, the limousine door opened. The sound was subtle, but in the tense quiet it sliced through the night like a blade. The officer glanced sideways, his grip on her tightening as if he sensed that control was slipping from his hands. The crowd leaned forward, whispers erupting into murmurs as the mayor stepped out. His presence was commanding, his tailored suit sharp against the dim night, his face carved with fury. He didn't rush, he didn't shout immediately, he simply walked toward them with the kind of power that doesn't need volume to be heard. The woman, still pressed against her car, felt the shift in the atmosphere. The officer barked again, demanding she cooperate, still blind to the storm building around him. But the mayor's voice cut through the night, steady and thunderous. "Do you know who you're touching?" he asked, his tone deadly calm, each word dripping with restrained rage. The officer froze for half a second, thrown off balance, but his arrogance kept him from loosening his grip. He turned, confusion flickering across his face, not yet recognizing the man before him. The mayor's eyes narrowed, his jaw tightening. He stepped closer, his voice rising now, sharp as steel. "That woman you've shoved into the dirt is the very reason this city still stands. She built the hospitals your officers rely on. She funded the schools your children attend. She poured her soul into the shelters that kept families off the streets. And you," he pointed at the officer with a trembling hand, his fury barely contained. "You dared put your hands on her." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Recognition spread like wildfire. The whispers grew louder. "It's her. Oh my God, it's her." Faces that had once been frozen in silence now lit up with shock and outrage. Phones zoomed in closer, cameras shaking with the adrenaline of recording a moment that would become history. The officer's grip faltered, his face drained of color as realization sank in. He looked at her again, really looked, and for the first time, he saw, beyond the skin, beyond his prejudice. He saw the woman whose face had graced magazine covers, whose speeches had inspired millions, whose donations had rebuilt half the city he patrolled. His mouth opened, but no words came. The authority he wielded moments ago was gone, crumbling under the weight of the truth. The woman straightened, her body trembling but her spirit unbroken. She stepped forward, no longer leaning against the car for support. Dust clung to her dress, her heels scuffed, but her presence radiated strength. She looked at the officer, her eyes steady, her voice quiet but powerful. "You didn't see me," she said, her words deliberate, heavy with meaning. "But now, everyone will." The cameras caught it all. Her calm defiance, the officer's shame, the mayor's fury. The moment crystallized into something far larger than the street they stood on. It was no longer about one act of prejudice, it was about the system, the silence, the history that had allowed it to happen. And now, with the world watching, it would no longer be ignored. The mayor stepped closer to her, his voice softer now, almost trembling. "I'm so sorry," he whispered, not just to her but to every person who had suffered unseen. She nodded once, her gaze fixed on the crowd, on the dozens of phones capturing her strength. She knew this wasn't just her story anymore, it belonged to everyone who had ever been silenced, dismissed, erased. In the days that followed, the footage spread like wildfire. Headlines screamed with outrage. The officer's face was plastered across screens, his career shattered in an instant. Protests rose in the streets, voices united in anger and in hope, and through it all, the woman remained steady. She gave no tearful interviews, no speeches of rage. Instead, she stood with the same quiet dignity she had that night, allowing the truth to speak louder than any words she could offer. Her legacy only grew stronger. Her story became a symbol, not just of wealth or power, but of resilience, of survival, of unshakable worth in the face of hatred. And though the scars of that night would never fade, neither would the strength she had shown. For she was never just a woman in heels, never just a billionaire. She was a force, a reminder that dignity cannot be stripped by prejudice, that worth cannot be erased by cruelty, and that sometimes the greatest power comes not from wealth or titles, but from standing tall after being pushed to the ground. And the officer, once drunk on his own authority, learned the most brutal lesson of all, that the world is always watching, even when you think it is not. The crowd stirred as whispers spread. Cameras lifted, recording every second. The mayor stepped out, his voice like thunder. "Do you know who you've just assaulted?" The officer froze, his face draining of color. Suddenly, the woman stood tall again, her pain hidden behind fierce eyes. The world would remember this moment not as her humiliation, but as his downfall. The hush that followed the mayor's voice was unlike any silence before. It wasn't the absence of sound, it was the collective intake of breath from 100 throats at once, the shock of seeing power shift in an instant. The officer's hand, which moments ago had gripped her arm with the confidence of unchecked authority, now trembled against his will. He looked at her again, but this time the image before him was unrecognizable. She wasn't the woman he had shoved, kicked, and degraded in front of strangers. She was something else entirely. Something bigger than him. Something larger than this moment. Her dress was torn at the hem, dust clinging to the fabric like shadows of the street. Her once polished heels bore fresh scratches, her palms raw from the pavement, but none of it mattered. What the crowd saw was not her bruises or her scuffs, but the way she carried them like a warrior wearing scars as armor. The phones capturing her didn't just record a victim, they recorded defiance, survival, a storm gathering behind eyes that had already seen too much and endured too long. The officer stepped back, the weight of realization pressing down on him like iron. His badge no longer gleamed with authority. It looked tarnished, heavy, a burden he could not carry. His throat tightened, his voice caught somewhere between apology and panic. But before he could speak, the woman did something he never expected. She lifted her chin. She didn't flinch, didn't cry, didn't plead. Her silence cut deeper than any word he could have heard. And when her eyes met his, he saw himself reflected there not as a protector of law, not as a man in uniform, but as the villain in a story being written in real time. The mayor's steps echoed against the pavement, each one a drumbeat of condemnation. The crowd parted, giving him a clear path, their phones still raised high, capturing the slow, deliberate march of justice walking toward injustice. His voice boomed again, louder this time, resonant with both anger and disbelief. This woman has built more for this city than you or your entire department could ever dream of, and you dared to lay your hands on her as though she were nothing. His hand swept toward the woman, his gesture not one of pity but of reverence, demanding that the crowd not just see her, but truly recognize her. Gasps spread like ripples in water as faces turned, recognition dawning. Some whispered her name aloud, uncertain at first, then louder as certainty spread like wildfire. The crowd buzzed with revelation. The officer felt the shift, the loss of control. His authority dissolved with every camera pointed at him, with every whisper of her name spoken like a prayer, a chant, a rallying cry. His mouth went dry. The badge on his chest felt like a curse. The woman took a single step forward. Her heels clicked against the pavement, not steady but strong enough to command attention. The crowd's noise softened, 1,000 eyes drawn to her, waiting, anticipating. She raised her hand, not to strike or accuse, but to hold herself upright against the storm of emotion coursing through her. When she spoke, her voice was low but carried with an authority that silenced even the mayor. "You thought you humiliated me," she said slowly, every word heavy, deliberate, "but what you've done is humiliate yourself, because the world will remember this night. Not for what you did to me, but for what it revealed about you." The crowd erupted, some cheering, others shouting in outrage, the tension spilling into noise that echoed off the buildings around them. The officer staggered back, his face pale, his hands twitching at his sides, as though still trying to cling to some shred of authority. But authority had left him. The woman's words had stolen it, the cameras had sealed it, and the mayor's presence had buried it. Suddenly, reporters who had been in the crowd pushed forward, their voices sharp with questions, their microphones thrust out like weapons of truth. "How does it feel knowing you assaulted one of the city's greatest benefactors? Do you realize the gravity of what you've done? Do you have anything to say for yourself?" The officer blinked against the flashing lights, his lips moving but no sound coming. He was a man drowning in the very ocean he had stirred. The woman stood taller now, her pain masked, her dignity intact. She didn't answer the reporters. She didn't need to. Her silence was her statement. Her presence was her testimony. She turned, her gaze sweeping across the crowd, meeting their eyes one by one, as if to remind them that this wasn't just her battle, it was theirs too. Every person who had ever been silenced, every soul ever dismissed because of the color of their skin, every child who grew up being told they weren't enough, she stood for them now, and they knew it. The mayor moved to her side, his hand hovering just near her elbow in a gesture of support but never touching, as though even he understood she needed no saving. She had already saved herself. He turned to the officer, his eyes blazing with rage. "You'll answer for this," he said firmly, his words final, his tone the sound of a gavel slamming down. And for the first time, the officer lowered his head, the fight gone. His figure shrinking in the presence of the woman he had tried to break. The footage of that night would travel farther than any of them could imagine. It would light up television screens, flood social media, spark debates in living rooms and boardrooms alike. But more than that, it would ignite something deeper in awakening. A demand for accountability, a reminder that dignity cannot be stolen and truth cannot be silenced. The woman walked away from that street not as a victim but as a symbol. Her pain was real, her wounds raw, but her strength was undeniable. And though she carried the memory of the boot that shoved her down, she also carried the knowledge that the world had seen her rise again, fiercer than ever. The officer's name would be forgotten, a footnote in history. But hers would echo, her story told and retold as proof that no act of hate, No moment of prejudice could erase the power of a woman who refused to stay down. And as the cameras clicked, as the mayor's voice thundered, as the crowd roared with both anger and hope, the city itself seemed to whisper in unison. This was not her downfall. This was his, and the world would never forget.